Howdy doody everybody, and welcome back to my journey across the United States. Today we're visiting North Carolina's weird folklore, and I mean that in a good way. Whether it be a mysterious call with conspiracy written all over it, or the final home of Blackbeard himself, your state surprised me with the incredibly strange things going on the whole way through. Anyways, before we get started, I just want to say thank you for watching and give you a quick reminder that if you want to see this small channel keep growing, all I ask for is a like, a subscription, and a comment. And also for you to watch until the end if you can. It'll never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyways, with this in mind, let's get into North Carolina's weird folklore. On November 22nd of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated John F. Kennedy while Kennedy was riding in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas, hitting him once in the back of his neck and another time in the head while passing by the Texas School Book Depository, where Lee Harvey Oswald was employed as a temporary employee. Now, if you're at all acquainted with this case, you'll know that to call it riddled with conspiracy would be an understatement. And one of the threads of this conspiracy, funny enough, leads directly to North Carolina. To give you a bit of history here, Oswald himself was a U.S. Marine veteran who was born in October of 1939 and throughout his youth had issues remaining enrolled in school, being described as emotionally disturbed by a psychiatrist once, perhaps due to his less than stable family life. After joining the Marines at age 17, he was court-martialed twice and even jailed, ultimately being discharged to the Marine Corps Reserve, after which he defected to the Soviet Union, briefly living in Minsk and marrying a Russian woman named Marina, even having a daughter with her. Now, despite all of this, Oswald returned from the Soviet Union in June of 1962 to the United States, settling in the Dallas area, and Oswald gained temporary employment at the Texas School Book Depository through some personal connections. This is where he allegedly did the job that sadly immortalized him. After this deed, Oswald engaged in a struggle with Dallas police officers, but was ultimately arrested in a movie theater and held in the Dallas police headquarters, where he was interrogated prior to his transfer to the city jail. Now, the reason I'm discussing this case in reference to North Carolina is because of the events of November 23rd of 1963. See, near midnight in Raleigh, North Carolina, a call was attempted to be made on behalf of Lee Harvey Oswald, who tried to call one or two phone numbers with a 919 area code. This call is often dubbed the Raleigh Call. Now, believe the tale if you will, because as far as records go, they're sparse to say the least. The Warren Commission investigation, the commission officially designated and established to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy that published a report in 1964, didn't report at all on this call, but we know about this call because of a Dallas County switchboard operator in the late 1960s that told authorities about it. According to a 1977 House Select Committee on Assassinations that conducted a new investigation into the Kennedy assassination, the operator stated that she was asked to call two numbers in Raleigh, North Carolina, and that Oswald was trying to reach a Mr. John Hurt. This operator was named Alvita Treon, and she showed up at 10:15 p.m. on November 23rd in 1963 at the Dallas City Hall for her 11 p.m. shift. Alvita was told by a colleague that two law enforcement officials would be present to eavesdrop on a call from Oswald that he was making from the jail later that evening, and according to Alvita Treon, these two individuals did indeed arrive. Shortly after this, a red light turned on to denote that there was a call ongoing. Treon listened to Oswald state the number he wanted to call and the name John Hurt. She wrote this information down. According to the official report, Oswald's calls weren't even actually placed. Rather, the numbers and names were recorded, and the other operator I mentioned told Oswald, "I am sorry, the number doesn't answer." After this, the two officials left the room where this was taking place, thanking the two operators. So, following this event, officials were actually able to track down a John Hurt that lived in Raleigh at the time of the Kennedy assassination. This John Hurt confirmed that the listed numbers were his, and they were actually still listed to him. This individual, one John David Hurt, lived at 201 Hillsborough Street in Raleigh in 1978, and apparently served in the military between 1942 and 1946, serving in Army counterintelligence in Europe and Japan. As far as the committee's opinion on this case, they were never able to find evidence confirming Oswald actually did try to call John Hurt, or that he was acquainted with him, only that Miss Treon and the other operator reported he did. This being said, there's no evidence that the two operators had motive to fabricate the story, and the committee wasn't sure how otherwise they could have provided such precise details regarding John Hurt's phone number and name. Regardless, none of this info made it to the House Select Committee's final report on the matter, and my guess is that whatever the link between Oswald and Hurt was may be lost to time. On January 24th of 1961, near Goldsboro, North Carolina, a Boeing B-52 Stratofortress was carrying two 3.8 megaton Mark 39 nuclear bombs as part of the Strategic Air Command's Airborne Alert mission coined Coverall, which had nuclear-armed bombs on a ladder route, continuously being flown into the Canadian Arctic and back to the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina. Up until around midnight on this day, things appeared to be going absolutely fine. That is until the bomber met with an airborne tanker for refueling in midair. During this refueling, the tanker told Major Walter Scott Tulloch that their craft had a leak in the right wing, and subsequently it aborted refueling. This sent the B-52 Stratofortress in question into a holding pattern off of the coast of North Carolina until the majority of their fuel was lost. This holding pattern was short-lived though, because shortly after reaching position, the pilot noted they'd lost, I kid you not, 37,000 pounds of fuel in just a 3-minute window. After this, they tried to make it back to the Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, but as they approached the airfield, the pilots couldn't keep the descent stable and lost control of the aircraft, and an entire wing apparently actually came off of the aircraft. At 9,000 feet, the crew abandoned the aircraft, and 5 of the 6 crew members safely ejected out of the plane. At the time that this occurred, the aircraft still had the 2 Mark 39 thermonuclear bombs aboard, and as the bomber plummeted towards Earth, people on the ground reported flashes of red light indicating fuel explosions may have been occurring. And at 12:35 a.m., it's thought the plane hit the ground, landing among tobacco and cotton farmland at Faro, just north of Goldsboro, North Carolina. Now, in terms of the 2 nuclear warheads, the first nuclear warhead with serial number 434909 that was in the aft bomb bay was ejected from the aircraft at around 9,000 feet. Upon this ejection, the safing pins on its arming rods were pulled out longitudinally, and the bomb dropped in a way similar to that of an intentional drop sequence. This led the MC-845 Bish generator to be actuated, and even the bomb's parachute deployed. The bomb, upon impacting the ground, also closed its crush switch, which normally would have detonated the bomb, but luckily the onboard arm safe switch didn't activate, so no detonation occurred. This bomb was found lying upright with its parachute hanging on trees about 1 mile from the aircraft wreckage. The weapon was disassembled on January 24th and returned to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, sustaining only a little bit of damage. Now, in terms of how close this weapon was to detonating, per a report by Sandia National Laboratory in February of 1961, it was basically 1 step away from detonating. Had the arm safe switch, the primary safing device, not been in safe mode, my reading indicates it would have detonated, aka a low-voltage switch prevented a nuclear disaster, and something as simple as an electrical short could have resulted in detonation. Heck, there were even later reports written by Sandia National Laboratory that mentioned these arm-safe switches were at times observed to inadvertently become set to arm when a stray current was applied to them. In other words, this was extremely close to a nuclear disaster occurring in North Carolina. But hey, judge for yourself. The second weapon, which was kept in the forward bomb bay, is thought to have ejected from the craft at around 2,000 to 5,000 feet, and it was found about 500 yards from the wreckage. It, too, had its safing pins pulled, but because it had released at such a low altitude, it hit the ground at a high velocity. The parachute was also unable to deploy, and thus there wasn't time for the high-voltage battery aboard to activate. This warhead impacted the ground and created a 9-foot wide crater that was 5 feet deep. It actually took 3 days of excavating to remove the warhead from the mud it was buried inside of, and upon removing it from the mud, they found that the arm safe switch on this warhead was set to arm and was functioning, though later analysis showed that this warhead's impact with the ground is what resulted in this bomb to get stuck in some state between being armed and safe, with the switch's indicator drum simply rotating to the arm position. The bomb, in other words, wasn't actually electrically armed. It's worth noting, too, that the fusion secondary component of this weapon was never recovered, and it's thought it may be buried around 180 feet underground. As you might expect, this is one of only a few incidents on U.S. soil where nuclear warheads came relatively close to detonating, and it brought to the front of the public's minds, and those of lawmakers, the very real possibility of an accidental nuclear explosion occurring on U.S. soil. Today, an easement remains formed around the site of the buried secondary portion of the warhead in the middle of a plowed field, and in 2012, about 3 miles north of the crash site, a historical road marker was placed in the town of Eureka, recounting this near-nuclear mishap. John Reed was a Hessian soldier, or one of about 30,000 German soldiers hired to aid the British during the Revolutionary War in America, who, near the end of the Revolutionary period, settled in the lower Piedmont Valley of modern-day North Carolina, with fellow German immigrants. Most of these families were farmers and raised corn and wheat. Now, this individual clearly up to this point had a humble life, but it's said that on a Sunday in 1799, a son of John Reed, or some sources say John Reed himself, was roaming around in Little Meadow Creek on their farm, which is in modern-day Cabarrus County, and found a large 17-pound rock that was, well, yellow. I think you see where this is going. In short, the Reed family did not identify that this rock was gold initially, and actually just used it as a doorstop. In 1802, though, a jeweler identified this as a gold nugget and purchased it for an even then measly $3.50, when in reality it should have been worth closer to $3,600. Regardless, Reed caught wind of what may be lying in wait on his land and formed the Reed mining operation with a few other locals, who supplied equipment and slaves and began to excavate the Little Meadow Creek. During the first year of his excavation, another gold nugget weighing in at 28 pounds was found by a slave named Peter, the largest found in the whole USA up to this point, and to this day the largest golden nugget found east of the Mississippi River. Now, the Reed family clearly wasn't the only place with gold here. When they heard of the luck Reed had on his land, other locals began to look in their creeks for gold too, and some of them were successful. All of this mining brought men, women, locals, and foreigners alike. Even Englishmen were migrating over to search for gold, and in 1831 even some underground mining began, with underground mining occurring on Reed's property too. All of this mining made Reed a very wealthy man, and he died rich as sin on May 28th of 1845. Now, even after Reed's passing, there was some mining occurring, and up to around the Civil War it was going strong, but afterwards it slowed down, and the last sizable nugget of gold on the property was found in 1896, with underground mining halted altogether by 1912. These days, the Reed Mine is a state historic site that you can visit, and you can even explore a few hundred feet of the old mine tunnels on the property. So there's a strange reference from 1583 in Florida, a report by one Sir George Peckham named A True Report of the Late Discoveries of the Newfound Lands, who notes that in the exploration of North America, explorers stumbled upon parrots of all things, flocks of them amounting to hundreds. Take a second here and think, is this normal? When you think of parrots, where geographically do you picture in your head? Maybe South America, Southern Asia, Oceania, Africa? Yeah, me too, but believe it or not, this hasn't always been the case. See, back in the day, there was a species named the Carolina Parakeet that was a colorful, medium-sized bird that would travel in large flocks, living in swampy forests and ranging between the Gulf of Mexico and even sometimes as far north as southern Ontario. Their namesake was a product of the fact that these birds were first identified in South and North Carolina, and at the time they weren't rare either. They were relatively common, and it's even thought that these birds may have been poisonous, as French-American naturalist John J. Audubon noted that cats would die when they ate them, and these birds were known to eat cocklebur seeds, which were poisonous seeds. Now you're probably thinking, wow, this is amazing, but I guess urbanization must have killed these little buggers off. And no shame, I thought this too at first, but apparently like pigeons or crows, these birds were smart and capable, and they adapted well to urban areas. But their cardinal sin, if you catch my drift, was that they were really, really noisy and traveled in large flocks that would amplify this noise. So folks were known to shoot at these birds because of it. Also, their feathers, and sometimes even their whole bodies, were used as accessories because of their vibrant colors, so hunting them down had some value in that regard as well. They were also known to ravage crops, consuming them and harming the yields of farmers. All of these factors together meant that folks were more than happy to shoot at these birds when they saw them around. To make matters worse, apparently these birds would surround a deceased bird, shrieking and mourning, which just gave people more opportunities to shoot at them. All of these factors resulted in the Carolina parakeet becoming rare, and the population that was once common became limited primarily to Florida by the early 20th century. Now, I should note, at this point, folks no longer really shot at these birds, in part because they were considered a novelty, or maybe even useful because they were known to consume some invasive plants, for instance the cockleburs I mentioned earlier. To be clear, they were probably not going to die out due to human intervention at this time. Heck, if things continued like this, we'd probably still have the Carolina parakeet. This brings us to exactly why this is in the weird video category. It's not just the fact that the Carolina parakeet existed, but rather because nobody quite knows why they went extinct. All we know is that after 1860, the bird was rarely reported anymore outside of Florida, and the last reported sighting east of the Mississippi outside of Florida was in Kentucky in 1878. As far as we're aware, the last captive Carolina parakeet died in the Cincinnati Zoo in February of 1918. Funny enough, it passed away in the same cage as the last passenger pigeon. As far as we're aware, the chief variables leading to the extinction of the species were hunting because they were annoying, hunting to acquire their colorful feathers, and deforestation, limiting their habitats. Regardless, just why they suddenly disappeared when they appeared to possibly be making a resurgence remains a mystery. William Andrew Jeffreys, born January 13th of 1817, was one of North Carolina's state senators, having been elected in 1844 and hailing from Franklin County, North Carolina. It's said that Jeffreys returned from a work-related trip to North Carolina in 1845 at one point, but after a short while following this trip, he began to feel sort of ill, and most reports speculate that on his travels he got typhoid fever. This fever led to weakness, and then hallucinations, and these hallucinations eventually manifested in him becoming genuinely afraid of being buried in the ground because of the worms that would inevitably consume his body. This topic apparently consumed his final days, leading him to make the request that if he did pass away, he be buried inside of a rock, telling this to anyone who would visit him. Now, being 28 years old at the time, folks generally didn't think he'd actually pass away from this illness, but as it became clear that Jeffreys wouldn't recover, his father agreed, and ultimately Jeffreys passed away on October 3rd of 1845. Because of this, after Jeffreys' passing, his father got a hold of a local stonemason, and this mason agreed to hollow out part of a rock on the edge of the Jeffreys family property, chiseling out this rock over the course of a year and creating a slab etched with an inscription to honor Jeffreys. Ultimately, a few years after this project began, Jeffreys was indeed buried inside of the rock, where he remains to this day. Nowadays, due to ongoing vandalism, all signs directing individuals to this man's entombed body in the rock have been done away with, but there Jeffreys remains, resting inside of this semi-hollow boulder. Usually, when I begin to research reports of strange noises or odd phenomena, as I do on this channel, I'm taken to fringe websites, maybe the Mutual UFO Network, or perhaps a society dedicated to researching crop circles like in my last video. But in the case of a phenomenon referred to as the Seneca Guns, I strangely find myself directed towards a website shepherded by none other than the logical, reasonable, and dare I say boring domain of government scientists, the U.S. Geological Survey, which reports on these unidentified booming noises that have been heard across the region, and also, to be clear, across the world. Here, the USGS describes the Seneca Guns as sounds heard throughout the eastern U.S., including North Carolina, detailing how following an earthquake that hit Charleston, these booming sounds were heard rolling across the region for weeks. I acknowledge Charleston's in South Carolina, that's just an example. Nowadays, these sounds coined the Seneca Guns, which were first written about in Washington Irving's Rip Van Winkle, are known to be commonplace, and maybe the most common for the residents of coastal North Carolina, if you believe the reports. And when these noises take place, loud booming is known to shake windows and doors of regional residents, even during clear sky conditions without a hint of a storm in the distance. During many episodes of these noises, it's been confirmed that there have been no nearby sonic booms from aircraft or blasts related to industrial activity. As for culprits, some attribute these phenomena to far distant storms or aircraft that aren't visible along the coast, or even to supernatural phenomena, such as the ghosts of old pirate ships firing their cannons. Some even say that this rumbling is due to ghostly cannon fire from Civil War battles of the past. More plausible explanations are distant sounds from tsunamis, venting gas, meteors entering the atmosphere, thunder, or earthquakes, as I previously hinted at. But a true culprit has yet to be identified beyond anything anecdotal. This being said, we do at least have these anecdotes to lean on, so I'll describe a few of them. Again, it's worth noting these historical anecdotes describe the same phenomenon outside of North Carolina. To start, in a document from 1862, there were rumbling sounds described to accompany the Great Neapolitan Earthquake of 1857 that occurred suddenly following it. In 1938, it was published that similar rumbling noises followed small earthquakes that hit England between the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that they sounded like the booming of cannons in the distance. Heck, even on the West Coast, there were weird noises like these noted to have followed the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. I could go on, but you get the picture. Now, there was a bit of scientific testing here. To start, let me briefly describe some fundamentals of earthquakes, though. Earthquakes are split into primary and secondary waves. The primary waves arrive first because they travel faster both through solids and liquids, and cause a sort of compressional motion, sort of like a slinky. Secondary waves travel slower than primary waves, and they only travel through solids, and they move side to side, causing a shearing sort of motion. Anyways, some scientists showed that within 0.02 seconds of primary waves arriving at a measurement station, a 40 to 70 hertz acoustic signal began that gradually dampened by the time the secondary wave arrived at their site. And they were able to use these observations to confirm that the earthquakes that made these signals were capable of making acoustic waves within the human threshold of hearing. In other words, earthquakes can make sounds that you can hear, so we should certainly consider near and distant tectonic activity to be a culprit for the creation of the Seneca Guns. In a similar light, it's totally feasible that meteors could create these noises, and given it takes a long time for a meteor's sonic boom to reach the surface of the Earth, usually longer than the meteor is visible during the day, it's reasonable to assume that these could be among the sources too, especially during the day when meteors would be less visible in the sky. Offshore tsunamis and generally just very large waves offshore are a similar story. We know that these can produce massive booming noises over long distances. So in short, to summarize this section, there are very, very large sonic boom sort of sounds being heard most commonly off the coast of North Carolina. They are real, they are not made up, and there are a variety of natural ways these sounds could form that are not controversial. However, none of these have been definitively proven as the source of the booming sounds, coined the Seneca Guns. Some posit supernatural explanations, but personally I veer towards the many natural explanations for the Seneca Guns. Off of the coast of North Carolina, there's a barrier island that's part of the same chain as the Outer Banks Barrier Islands that separates various sounds in North Carolina from the Atlantic Ocean. Now, to be clear, Nag's Head is the city in question on this barrier island, and it's sort of a place that is categorically not weird in character, in modern day at least. It's a relaxing vacation spot whose beaches and sand dunes bring vacation goers year-round, and the population as of 2020 was a paltry sum over 3,000. This being said, let's circle back to its name, Nag's Head, and ask what on earth is a nag and what happened to its head. To start, let's look at what the word nag means. A nag is a Middle English phrase for a horse, or sometimes for a small horse, referring to a pony. It can even refer to a mule. It's thought that this word is related to the Dutch word for a horse, a nag, or perhaps even the sound neigh. Alright, now that we've pinned down the term nag, let's identify what's going on with its head. As the story goes, regarding the head portion, before the 1830s, when Nag's Head gained a reputation as a resort town, the town was frequented by individuals in the wrecking industry and pirates. These individuals would engage in the shady act of tying lanterns to the heads of old horses or mules and having them walk along the island shore. Apparently, this would lure passing ships into the shallow waters near the barrier islands, and once they ran aground, these pirates or wreckers would loot the ships and leave them stranded. You can actually see some remaining evidence of this, or at least a nod to the folklore in the town flag and emblem of Nag's Head, which depicts a horse or mule with a lantern hanging below its head, a nod to its less than squeaky clean history. While these days, North Carolina's Outer Banks are largely a tourist destination during the summer, and they're also known for harboring a diverse ecosystem, back in the day, in the early 1700s, they were also briefly home to one of the most notorious pirates in history, and the holder of the notorious Yami Yami no Mi, Edward Thatch, or Teach, or as he's better known, Blackbeard. Now, old Edward was born in England in the late 1600s, and it's thought he was born to a respectable and perhaps even wealthy family due to him being able to read and write, and little is known about his early life, but it's speculated that he arrived in the Caribbean in the late 17th century upon a merchant ship, possibly a slave ship. After this, Edward was a sailor that operated as a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession, and during this struggle, he was reported to have shown uncharacteristic amounts of courage. Following this, Edward would settle in the West Indies, particularly on the island of New Providence, an island largely inhabited by transient individuals, where pirates, traders, and hangers-on would meet to conduct business and to get away from the heavy weight of the law. It was here that he met and joined the pirate crew of pirate captain Benjamin Hornigold, who led him down a path that intersected with a ship named the La Concorde, a French ship that carried a cargo of slaves. Edward would capture and claim this ship as his own, officially becoming a pirate captain and renaming the ship the Queen Anne's Revenge. It's worth noting the name of this ship may have been a political statement in and of itself, as at the time of its naming, Queen Anne was dead, and George I, her replacement, was a German prince, who was largely disliked by Catholics, Scotsmen, and pirates. With this ship, Edward grew out a long dark beard and gained the reputation he has today, as a ruthless individual who would raid cargo ships around dawn, often taking them without any resistance due to the fear associated with his name. Now, at this time when Blackbeard was running amok, the Carolinas were of course a colony of Great Britain, and sick of the pirate activity, they gave all pirates operating in the area an opportunity that would be hard to refuse. The opportunity to be pardoned in exchange for declaring loyalty to the crown and never engaging in piracy again. Now, after a brief stint where Blackbeard blockaded the Charleston, South Carolina harbor, Blackbeard thought on this deal and decided with a small group of his men to sail to North Carolina in June of 1718, beaching the Queen Anne's Revenge at the modern-day Beaufort, North Carolina, and trekking to Bath, North Carolina, the capital of the colony, where he took the loyalty oath and lived out much of the end of his life. Here in Bath, Blackbeard would live and establish a base, so to speak, traveling between Bath and an area off the Ocracoke Inlet in the Outer Banks. It's even thought that Blackbeard married the daughter of a local plantation owner around Bath, who would have supposedly been his 14th wife, but there's little in the way of evidence here. Now, around July, the governor of North Carolina, named Eden, gave Blackbeard permission to sail to St. Thomas to work as a privateer. It's thought that in part, this was done to remove yet another pirate from Bath, and he was given the title to a ship to do so. But this life as a privateer didn't last long, as by the end of August, Blackbeard once again engaged in piracy, largely operating out of the Delaware Bay while still spending some time in the Outer Banks of North Carolina, an area that was apparently Blackbeard's favorite place to anchor because it was an excellent place to view ships traveling the coast of North Carolina. This is essentially the story of Blackbeard, his last 4 or 5 months of life between June and November of 1718, during which he largely dwelled off of the coast of the state of North Carolina and in Bath. After this, Blackbeard and his small remaining crew would be killed in a battle with British naval officer Lieutenant Robert Maynard, thus marking the end of one of history's most notorious pirates off the coast of North Carolina. Because of this history, today at the North Carolina Maritime Museum in Beaufort and in some other maritime museums throughout North Carolina, you can find artifacts from Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, and learn more about the history of piracy in the region. The so-called Big Hole is the nickname given to an underground facility in Chatham County, North Carolina that's steeped in mystery. Though this site was bought by AT&T in 1962 for $27, to this day the site's function is not entirely known, and this lack of certainty and the close guard kept on this site combine to drive rampant speculation about what lies below the surface at this site run by AT&T and its partnership with the US government. Looking at this site on Google Maps, it's pretty clear why people are suspicious of it. I mean, just look at it. It's essentially an empty field with a couple of buildings, yet this warrants a 10-foot tall fence, a 60-car parking lot, and concrete barriers and spotlights. Regardless, given the vacuum of information regarding the Big Hole, let's start with what we do know. As I said, the site was bought by AT&T in 1962, and the property was 191 acres. In 1966, the site was commissioned as one of the 60 Autovon centers, standing for Automatic Voice Network, a network of relay and switch centers, 20 of which were underground facilities like this one in Chatham County. The site of the Big Hole is also relatively remote, being around 24 miles from Raleigh, while remaining relatively close to other military installations. AT&T paid $7 million and spent 4 years excavating and constructing the site, and the site is supposedly 100,000 square feet in total, containing telephone routing equipment. If you approach the facility to look through the fence, which I don't recommend, you'll first be met by a 10-foot tall fence with barbed wire on top, and beyond it, you'll see a parking lot, guard shacks, floodlights, and strange-looking bleached concrete and silver structures sticking out of the ground, not exceeding 2 stories. On the tallest 2-story building, there's an abundance of communication equipment. A 1984 description of the facility by AT&T states that close cooperation between AT&T and government agencies during the planning of these blast-resistant transmission facilities has produced a highly reliable communications system. AT&T's hardened communications network should provide the United States with communications through any natural disaster and even during a nuclear attack. We also know that the Big Hole is a proper fallout shelter, and this underground facility sits on gravel and coils to absorb the shock that might be associated with a nuclear attack, even having 1.5-foot thick walls that are covered in copper to protect against an EMP. Inside, there are backup generators, bunks, and food and medical supplies that could sustain 30 employees for 3 weeks. There's also on-site air filtration systems. Finally, we also know that those that have worked within the Big Hole keep quiet about what goes on there. They keep quiet to the point that folks aren't actually entirely sure if the facility is still in use. Though despite this, AT&T or the government still maintain really tight security around it. Okay, this is about all that we know about this site, which is to say quite a bit. However, to locals, and frankly to me, it still feels relatively fishy that what is essentially an underground communications facility meant to be nuke-proof is guarded with barbed wire fences, barricades, spotlights, and more. This brings us to the conspiracies surrounding this site. To start, there's the classic claim of aliens. A claim by one local, Randy Pelosi, detailed by IndieWeek.com, recounts a warm summer day with clear skies in 1991. On this day, Randy recounted a, I quote, crazy cloud thing that appeared over the Big Hole, which repeatedly struck the Big Hole property with lightning. Pelosi, after this, mentioned that his friend had a theory that the site was used to relay messages between humans and extraterrestrials, though Pelosi wasn't sure of this. Others speculate that after Audubon was decommissioned in the 90s, the site became an installation for government contractors, possibly mercenaries like a company I don't really want to say the name of, that has something to do with water. These claims are supported by frequent reports of military-style helicopters patrolling the woods surrounding the site, and individuals in the woods surrounding the site being intercepted and told to leave by armed individuals. Now, I don't really know entirely what to think about this. I'm not saying I believe UFOs are hiding in clouds over top of the site, but I'd also bet my sweet bippy that the government and AT&T don't want civilians, or more accurately, foreign intelligence, to know what's going on here. And hey, I guess that's fine with me. But if you've got any stories of your own about the Big Hole, I demand that you list them in the comments below. North Carolina, it's been my honor to cover your state. I had so much fun reading about your weird folklore. So some quick updates. Check out T-Spot if you want to watch our old live streams or occasionally see some different content now and again. Otherwise, a new video series will be starting soon, where we take a quick break from weird places and states and cover their amazing and wonderful places instead. Let me know in the comments if you want your state's amazing places to be covered. I'm trying to gauge whether this is worthwhile. Also, I owe a few states some follow-up videos, and I plan to cover some weirdness in warm states throughout the winter months, because it's a bit chilly for me in Michigan now. Anyways, with all of this in mind, whether you just stumbled upon a casket wedged inside of a rock, or if you heard a strange, loud booming noise off the coast while you were walking on the beaches of North Carolina, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.